they can join. That's just fine. My name is Sophia Zanowski. I am the Coordinator of Development and Registrar at St. Bernard's. I'm very excited to be here with you tonight. We have a great presentation lined up. So before we get to the presentation, just a couple of housekeeping and also some introductions. So I work with IT a little bit at St. Bernard's, so just a couple of tech updates. We ask that you keep yourself muted throughout the presentation, and then at the end we'll open up for some Q&A. And how we're going to run that this evening is we're going to have our two presenters, Michele and Laura, present for you tonight, and then I'm going to moderate a Q&A. If you have a question at any time throughout the presentation or at the end, feel free to put that in the chat box, and then I'm going to moderate that and read them and hand them off to Michele and Laura. Just know though that if you put anything in there during the actual presentation, we just won't get to it until the end during the Q&A. And if you have any tech difficulties, feel free to try to put them in the chat box too, and I'll see if I can help you out throughout the presentation. Now we have a couple of co-sponsoring organizations tonight, so I want to introduce you to those. So to start, we have St. Bernard's. We are a graduate school located in upstate New York. We have physical campuses in Rochester and Albany, and we serve students from across upstate New York, as well as across the country through our distance learning program. We have 4 master's degrees in theology and philosophy. And then we also have 4 certificate programs where you can take a cluster of our graduate courses on a niche topic, such as Catholic bioethics, Catholicism and the fine arts, Catholic philosophy, but you don't have to have a bachelor's degree, and you don't need to commit to the full master's degree, but you still get to experience what we have to offer in our classrooms. We also encourage people to audit one of our courses where you get to sit in on the lecture, participate in the discussions, but you do not have to do the assignments. My mother loves this option. She usually audits classes in the summer because that's when we offer some of our really exciting electives, and the summer classes are shorter. They're only 7 weeks. So I'll be sending out an update email after this event, probably tomorrow or Monday, and I'll provide more information about St. Bernard's and what we do, what we offer, some of our upcoming events in that email. Now, one of the other organizations we have with us tonight is Feminists Choosing Life of New York. Michele is here representing them. FCLNY is a statewide human rights coalition that's built on pro-life feminism and a consistent life ethic. They believe that peace will not be achieved until all forms of violence are eradicated. And that includes violence such as abortion and sex trafficking, like we're talking about tonight, but also other issues like war, the death penalty, euthanasia, poverty, and domestic violence. They seek to educate people on these topics and then also agitate and organize activism around the root causes of violence and the social forces that fuel inequality in our society. So this work, as you can imagine, is pretty broad, and it takes on many forms. So for example, in the kind of education realm, you'll see right now that there's another organization called Women's Alliance Against Violence that's filed a lawsuit challenging the Reproductive Health Act in New York. Feminists Choosing Life is assisting that organization in educating others about this lawsuit, how you can get involved, what the implications of the lawsuit are, etc. But then on the other side, you might see members from FCL on the ground at diaper banks or pregnancy centers out doing work in the community. They have really wonderful, FCL has really wonderful social media pages and newsletters where you can learn more about the education they do and the work that they do. So I definitely encourage you to learn more about them if anything you hear about tonight interests you. Then we also have our second presenter. This is some graphics from FCL. They do a lot of events, so you can find out more on their website. It is a really beautiful website. So then we have our second organization, which Laura here is representing, which is Global Centurion. This is a nonprofit that fights human trafficking, specifically by focusing on who and what fuel the market demand for human trafficking. So this is, perpetrators, exploiters, and buyers. So in this way, they seek to end modern slavery, which is human trafficking, by preventing it at its source. And they kind of have a 3-pronged approach to their mission: research, education, and then partnership. So not only will you see some of their members out in the community doing events such as this one on the education leg of the stool, if you will, but then you'll also find them behind the scenes doing extensive legal and interdisciplinary research, teaching, and scholarship. We are so excited to be able to put on this event tonight thanks to these organizations and thanks to our two speakers. And so without further ado, I'd like to give a brief introduction of our two speakers before I hand it over to them. So we have Michele Sterlace, and she currently serves as the Executive Director of Feminists Choosing Life of New York, which I just talked about. Michele obtained her JD in Law and Social Justice, cum laude, from the University at Buffalo School of Law. She earned her BA in Politics from NYU, magna cum laude, and she holds an LLM in Conflict Resolution from the Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution at Pepperdine. For years, she worked as a child's attorney in the Integrated Domestic Violence part of the New York State Supreme Court. And she served as a confidential judicial law clerk for the Chief Justice of the U.S. District Court for the WNY, and as an assistant principal administrator of the court's alternative dispute resolution program. So Michele has a very extensive background in law and then in activism through FCL. And then our second presenter is Laura Lederer. She's a subject matter expert on human trafficking and is the president of Global Centurion. She serves as a subject matter expert on trafficking in persons for the US government agencies, including US Department of Defense, Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Justice. Prior to her work at Global Centurion, she served for 8 years in the US Department of State as a senior advisor on trafficking in persons to Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs. And in that position, she helped stand up the office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. From 2002 to 2009, she was also the executive director of the Senior Policy Operating Group on Trafficking in Persons, which is a group that staffed the president's cabinet level interagency task force on trafficking in persons. She founded and directed the Protection Project at Harvard University's JFK School of Government, and then moved that program to Johns Hopkins in 2000. At Georgetown Law Center, she developed and co-taught the first law school course on human trafficking. So Laura also has an extensive background in law, specifically focused on human trafficking, which is one of the topics of our event tonight. And of course, that's a whole lot of information on our organizations that we have here tonight. So I'll be sending out an email after this to give you links and provide you resources where you can follow up for more information. And so with that, I am going to pull up our presentation and turn it over to Laura and Michele.
Okay. Sophia, are you ready for me? Can you hear me? Whoops.
Hi, Laura. I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak here tonight and to talk with you about sex trafficking, female poverty, and feminism. I think right now, in particular, we're all looking for bridges across, sort of ways to connect as the politics and policies are changing in our country. And so I think this is a particularly apt subject that really does provide bridges across there where we can build new programs that help make the world a better place. Next slide. So I'm going to start by talking about, whoops, can she hear me? Next slide. So I'm going to, well, let me, there we go. I'm just going to start briefly by just saying that for many, many years, right, I've been in this work for 30 years, and for many, many years, human trafficking was seen as kind of a fringe problem. It wasn't really understood to be a form of violence against women. I had a lot of, I started in the feminist movement, and I grappled for about a decade trying to get them to understand that trafficking is a form of violence against women. Now I think we've made a lot of progress in that. We also had a problem helping people to understand how huge an issue this was. And we still need to gather research on the global and the national and the local statistics on trafficking. We don't have a really good handle on it yet, but the most recent work that a group called Walk Free does out of Australia says that there are 45.8 million people who are trapped in modern day slavery and who are trapped in trafficking, and that 2/3 to 7/8 of those are women and girls. Then in terms of I know Michelle's going to talk a little bit further about the supply, demand, and distribution, but Global Centurion has spent a lot of time looking at the link between that triangle of activity. A lot of the focus in the first years after we passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was on the supply. It was on the poor nations that were sending women and children to other places. And we were arguing that the problem, it was not just with those poor nations, but with the resource-rich nations, the Gulf states in the Middle East, Europe, the US, Australia, who are the destination countries for the victims. And so if we look at that kind of triangle of activity, we know that the US is one of the largest places, the largest destinations for trafficking of persons. And not just international trafficking, but also we have our own homegrown industry. We have our own citizens who are being trafficked in this country to others in this country. So and then you can also start to look at the local level, and most of you are probably from New York, but almost every state now is doing their own research on the effects of trafficking, and they're gathering statistics on how big a problem it is in their state. And when we start to put all of those stats together, we'll also get, I think, a very good idea of the just the depth of the problem. Next slide. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the legal aspects of this, but just suffice it to say that the definition in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is that trafficking is the recruiting, transporting, harboring, obtaining, and selling of a person by force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of commercial sex or forced labor. And while some organizations have identified a whole lot of different kinds of trafficking, the two main types that we see in the United States are sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And then in labor trafficking, you can talk about involuntary servitude and debt bondage, and a lot of the statutes that we have that are a part of that labor trafficking. But these are the two main types of trafficking that we see in the US. Go ahead. So here I've just given you this definition. Now, one difference between labor trafficking and sex trafficking is that in 2008, the Congress passed an amendment to the law adding soliciting and patronizing to the definition of sex trafficking. And so, and the purpose of that was to get to those buyers, those purchasers of sex, who are, as Sophia said, fueling the market. I do a lot of work with the Department of Defense, and we passed a statute in the Uniform Code of Military Justice that prohibits our guys from purchasing sex anywhere in the world, not just where it's, where prostitution is illegal, but anywhere in the world where they may be stationed, they are not allowed to purchase sex, because we realize that that they are becoming a part of the problem of trafficking. And so later Congress added those two, soliciting and patronizing, to address the purchase of sex at the federal level. So I think we have kind of a fuller definition that covers that whole triangle of activity now than we did when we first started in the year 2000. Go ahead. So this is just to lay a little bit of the background for you on this issue. This is a huge issue, and it's very. I'm not going to do a tip 101 today, but I do want to say that human trafficking is a problem of law enforcement. It's a problem, it's a human rights abuse. It's a national security problem. It's an economic and business issue. It's an issue for transportation. Now the Department of Transportation is talking about all the different forms of transportation that are used to take trafficking victims here and there for sale. And then most recently, what we've discovered is that it's a health issue too. And the reason I want to focus on the health aspects tonight is because those health aspects are aspects that almost everyone across every political spectrum, across all the policy debates, can agree is a problem that we can work on together. And so this is one of the bridges across that I'm looking for in terms of the way we work on stopping human trafficking. Next slide.
Laura, I don't want to stop you when you're on a roll because this is really wonderful, but I think there might be a beeping going on with your microphone.
Really? Okay.
I don't know if you can hear it, but it sounds like a couple of us from the chat box.
Is it mine though, or is it, sometimes people have to all mute theirs?
Right.
I don't think it's mine. Let me see. What could I do to check that?
Well, you know what? I know that you are going to hand it off to Michele in a couple slides. So I'm thinking, why don't we let you go through your next. Yeah, that turned it off. Oh, no, I think, are we?
But that muted it.
Yeah, that muted it. And now you're muted. So let's see. I'm thinking, Laura, if you do your next couple slides and then Michele takes over, if you have headphones you could grab maybe. Actually, that's good. I can't hear the beeping anymore. That worked.
Okay. All right.
Oh.
So let's go to the next slide.
Okay, here we go.
If I need to hand it over early to her, I will. So
okay.
This is the last slide on the definition on what trafficking is, and it breaks down the legal definition into a more understandable set of elements. So there's an action, means, and purpose in trafficking. The actions are a whole set of actions: recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining. And then I told you about patronizing, soliciting, and advertising. That's for sex trafficking only. And why do we have all of those? Because when we started to talk about passing a law in the US, a lot of people said, we don't need more laws. We already have enough laws. Why don't you use the recruiting law, the kidnapping laws? Why don't you use the rape laws? Why don't you use, and we said no, because we needed to get to that whole pipeline of activity. If the recruiting starts in Mexico and comes across the US border, and then there's a place where these trafficking victims are held for a while, and then they're moved to another state. All of those are part of the pipeline of trafficking, and we wanted the definition to cover all of those. And so in that way, we were able to get reach that whole network, that criminal network really that makes up trafficking, and not just the rapist or the kidnapper or the harborer and so on and so forth. And then the means: force, fraud, or coercion. And I think there's a slide a little further back that tells a little bit more about that breaks these down, because when we started to talk to trafficking victims right after the law was passed, they would say, no, I wasn't trafficked. And then we would say, well, were you beaten? Were you hit? Were you kicked? Were you? And they'd say, oh, yeah, that happened to me. And so we were able to say, well, then, yes, you are a trafficking victim, because this is what is meant by force, by fraud, by coercion. And then it's important to mention that any minor who's found in commercial sex, for whatever reason, is per se, in other words, just because they're found there, a victim of trafficking. You don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion in a court of law for them to be a victim. And then the final third of that is the purpose. They're either commercial sex or forced labor. And tonight we're just talking about sex trafficking. Okay, next slide. I'm not going to go over all of these. There's a ton of laws. In fact, just in 2018 and 19, 5 new anti-trafficking laws were passed. So there are about 25 laws that from the year 2000 until today, the last 20 years, have been passed addressing one or another aspect of trafficking. But these are the most, I think, most important ones. Go ahead, keep going. And Michele, you're going to talk about the state laws. Do you want to do that now, or?
Sure, I can whip through those.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you, Laura, and thank you, Sophia. Thank you, St. Bernard's, so much. I know we're sort of constrained with time, so I'm just going to read quickly. I also I'm aware that it's recorded so that folks can listen, but not necessarily see what's on the slides. So I'm going to sort of read through them quickly. Not until 2007 did New York enact its first human trafficking law. Again, you see in 2008, it enacted the Safe Harbor for Exploited Children's Act. Importantly, it defined a prostituted minor as a sexually exploited child that was entitled to services rather than deserving of criminal prosecution. And you see a lot of that now with the Human Trafficking Intervention Court initiative that happens in New York, where there's a treatment of victims with services rather than with punishment. In 2010, again, New York enacted a civil procedure law that allows sex trafficking victims to vacate prostitution convictions. And this is interesting because you have many survivors of sex trafficking wanting to, get jobs and obtain gainful employment. And what serves as an impediment to that is conviction. A criminal conviction really from their past. So it's helpful to women moving forward. 2015, you've got New York enacted the Trafficking Victims Protection and Justice Act. I could go on with that, but you've got some information there. Really focused, I could say, on punishment of the buyer of trafficking, the demand portion of the sort of the market model of sex trafficking, where you have supply, demand, and distribution. In 2018, New York enacted the End Child Sex Trafficking Act. And that was extraordinarily essential because it allows, like Laura had alluded to, under the federal statute, it allows for children, child victims, no longer needing to prove that they were forced or coerced into trafficking. So really, essentially, under the age of 18, children cannot consent to being trafficked or engaging in prostitution. You can go to the next slide, please, Sophia. Again, more laws here. New York has done quite a bit to address trafficking, but interestingly enough, on the first slide, it makes it clear, though, somehow human trafficking cases have been steadily rising in New York, up 70% in 2020, right? So New York has done quite a bit to address, but obviously there's a whole lot more it can do. Starting at the top, we see 2 bills that New York enacted into law. It expands the availability of that incredible human trafficking intervention court. And then 8874 requires facilities, hotels, inns, and motels to post this national trafficking hotline poster or trafficking hotline palm cards, which Laura will talk about later. In her study, she identifies as these hotline posters and hotline palm cards are so essential for victims of sex trafficking to finally break free. And so that's extraordinarily valuable, I see here in New York. In 2019, you had New York enacting public health law, which sort of extends the requirement to post these hotline trafficking posters in healthcare facilities, such as hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers. But what is interesting to note, and this is an area where FCLNY is extremely interested in exploring, is that it seems as though many private facilities that provide abortion, including Planned Parenthoods, are somehow excluded from the requirement to provide this hotline number in the form of a poster or a palm card. And then lastly, just wanted to make reference to the cases that are brought before the Human Trafficking Intervention Court. They help to discredit the popular belief that modern day slavery and sexual enslavement of girls and women occurs in our own, it doesn't occur in our own backyards. It shows that sex trafficking occurs in our own backyards and often in these neighborhoods where we would never think occurred. Next slide, and then I get to hand it back over to Laura. So.
Okay, Michele, thank you so much. And I think the reason that it's important to go over the state laws too is because while the federal law sort of sets the standard and the norm, a lot of the law enforcement takes place at the state and local level and doesn't rise to the federal level. And so it is really important for states to pass their own laws and to enforce the laws that they pass. So thank you for summarizing what the situation is in New York right now. So I just want to start with a short story. We began this work on the health consequences of sex trafficking before anybody was talking about it. When the Susan B. Anthony group came to us and asked us, is there abortion in trafficking? And I had just come out of 8 years at the State Department, and I had traveled all around the world, and I had seen a lot of victim shelters, and I had heard a lot of stories of what victims had been through. And one thing I heard over and over again in these shelters and in places all around the world, in Turkey, in Argentina, in Australia, in all around the world, young women were saying, yes, I got pregnant. And I had this terrible abortifacient, and they did this, they did that, here's what happened to me. And so I said to Marjorie Dannenfelser, yes, there is a lot of abortion in trafficking. I know it's true, but I only know it anecdotally. And she said, well, how can we prove it? How can we show it? And I said, you'd have to ask the survivors. And at that time, this was early 2000, like about 2008, 2010, survivors were not talking at all about what had happened to them. It was still taboo. We had very few that were testifying in Congress. But we had a wonderful philanthropic donor who gave us enough money so that we could bypass the government, where a study like this could never have gotten done. And we set up a series of focus groups, and we began to put the word out in cities all around the United States. And we ended up going to 22 cities across the United States and having focus groups of anywhere from 7 to 14, sometimes more than that, survivors, and asking them what had happened to them. And we had agreed early on that we didn't want to just say, did you have an abortion? We wanted to find out the full sort of panoply of health issues that were facing trafficking victims, and to address the issue of pregnancy and miscarriage and abortion and childbirth in the context of the larger health issues. And this became a huge study, which is now the landmark study on the health consequences of sex trafficking. Representative Chris Smith had the study read into the record on the floor in Congress. And as we were doing this survey of the health consequences, we also were asking these survivors their stories, and they were telling us, and I use this one because it sort of encompasses all of the kinds of problems that these young women and children faced. So this young woman said, when I turned 13, I'd had enough of the abuse in my own home and I ran away. I didn't know where to go, so I just went to the center of town and I hung out. A man saw me there and he came up to me and he said he was looking for a protege. I didn't even know what that meant, but it sounded good to me. He said, you know, do you have a place to stay? And when I told him no, he said I could stay at his house. When we got to his house, he pulled out a bottle of gin and he had me drink. And the next thing I remember is waking up all sick and wet and hurt. He had drugged the bottle of gin. The next day he took me out on the street, told me what I had to do. When I said I didn't want to, he threatened me with a gun. He pistol whipped me, and that's how I got into this life and couldn't get out. Over the next year, he hit me, punched me, kicked me, beat me, slashed me with a razor. I had forced unprotected sex with customers. I got pregnant twice. I had 2 abortions. I have so many injuries, so many illnesses, hepatitis C, STDs, stomach problems, back pain, a lot of psychological issues. I overdosed on drugs twice and was taken to the hospital where they saved me, but then released me back to my pimp again. So this story sort of encompasses what I call the 3 I's: illnesses, injuries, and impairments that face almost all trafficking victims. And it's important for us to have the stories as well as the kind of the stats when we are doing this work. Next slide. Is the beeping still going on? Or it's okay?
Yeah, it still is there. I
Yes.
think just on my end.
Oh, okay. Gosh, I don't know whether I can. There's something that says recording here that maybe but in any event, we got through half. We wanted to get 300 survivors to talk to us about their health issues. We got through half of those when we, still chirping. I'm so sorry. I don't know what it could be, but I'll just keep going. And if you can't, if you can't understand me, then maybe Michelle, you can take over. And we stopped because we discovered that over 87.8% of survivors had been to a hospital or a doctor's office or a clinic during the time when they were being trafficked, and they had sought help, and the health providers were treating what was in front of them and then releasing them back to their trafficker. So they were actually fixing up the merchandise, if you will, and facilitating the trafficking. And so we knew we had to publish what we had and get it out into the public, and you know, make sure that this actually made a difference. We didn't want just you know, research that sat on a shelf. This was applied research that we wanted to affect change. Next slide. I referred to the way we went about this. We had these series of focus groups. We asked a series of open-ended questions about, well, there may be some slides that were omitted here, but in any event, what we did was a two-pronged study. There were both qualitative collection of information and quantitative. So we asked a series of open-ended questions about trafficking and about what had happened to them, and let them tell their full story. And then we also asked them to fill out a survey, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And in that survey were also a series of questions about the healthcare providers and what type of facilities they had visited and whether the healthcare provider knew about the survivor's situation. So in the end, we had 300 stories, and we had 300 surveys, and we had a wealth of information about what had happened to survivors when they were actually victims of trafficking. Next slide. So we wanted to focus, as I had said, on all of the reproductive issues. everything from birth control to pregnancy to miscarriage to abortion, forced abortion, morning after pill, and live births. And I was prepared for, I knew there was a lot of pregnancy in sex trafficking. I knew there was a lot of miscarriage. I knew there was a lot of abortion. I was actually shocked at how many live births there were in trafficking, that women were choosing to have their children while they were trapped in the trafficking, and that this is a whole nother issue, an intergenerational issue that we've even yet 20 years out from the passage of our model law that we have yet to really address. Next slide. So this was what the health questionnaire looked like. Somebody said to me at one point, why didn't you make it like an SAT test so you could fill in the bubbles? And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want this to be user-friendly. I want them to be able to just go through it and say, yeah, that happened to me. Yes, that happened to me. That, I'm stopping here because comedian Richard Pryor was born in a brothel. I didn't know that. That's fabulous information, and that's the kind of stuff that we really need to know, and that I think there's not enough information about. Thank you for whoever put that there. Again, exactly. You can see the pain in his life. In any event, this is what those surveys looked like when they came back. We were stunned. The kinds of health problems, we tried to divide it into the health systems that the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, that the World Health Organization and every doctor around the world uses for symptoms. And then we asked them to just go through and circle anything that had happened to them. And you can see the physical, gastro and respiratory and cardio, and then the psychological down here, and then some of the STDs and substance abuse and some of the gynecological and reproductive issues, and keep going. Next slide. And then the issue of abortion, and then injuries, which there's a lot of injuries in trafficking, because there's a lot of violence in trafficking, because as one survivor said to me, we don't do this willingly. We're forced to do it, and oftentimes it's physical force that keeps us, that forces us into it and keeps us in it. And so here you can see injuries to all the various parts of the body, and threatened with a weapon, strangled, burned, kicked, punched, beaten. And as I said, we deconstructed all of that that one word force so that survivors could tell us what really happened to them. And then we asked them, did you receive treatment? Did you seek treatment anywhere? And they would circle where they had gone for treatment. Did the doctor know? Did they ask? And so on and so forth. Next slide. And then there was a whole page on all of the pregnancy, miscarriage, morning after, abortion, all of those kinds of issues. And we asked survivors to think back and tell us how many pregnancies, how many children they had, how many abortions they had. And here, this is a case of a young woman who was trafficked when she was 13 years old into by a motorcycle gang in Tennessee. The guy who ran it had a brother who was in the police department in their city. And so he was able to run, he had a trailer, kind of a whole trailer city where he was running this thing out of. And she was trapped in this from the time she was 13 until she was 33. She had 17 abortions during that time, almost all of them at the same Planned Parenthood around the corner. When I first gave her this sheet, she kind of said, so many I can't even remember. And I asked her to go back and count because we wanted to know. And this is the kind of information we had. And survivors said to us, no one has ever asked me this before. No one ever asked me if I was pregnant. No one ever asked me if I had children. No one ever asked me if I had abortions. No one ever asked me where and how. And so this is information that I think still we're having a lot of trouble getting out. I want the Justice Department to ask about forced abortions when they're prosecuting cases, because it is a way that we can prove force in trafficking, but they don't do that. They don't do that. It has to be volunteered right now. So this is the kind of thing that we're still in the foothills of consciousness in terms of how we're addressing this, and what we need to know and how we need to use that knowledge. Go ahead, next slide. So then the next 5 or 6 are just a series of charts that sort of summarize the information in those surveys. Physical health problems, as you might guess, 99% said that they had at least one physical health problem. Most of them had multiple physical health problems. And then you can see neurological and general health issues like stomach and that kind of thing, injuries, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, dental. This is just a few of them that we tabulated for Congress. Go ahead. And psychological health problems, again, 98% reported at least one psychological issue, but most of them had multiple psychological issues: depression and flashbacks and shame and guilt and post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is kind of a combination of symptoms and a syndrome, and attempted suicide. And as one survivor said to me, you're only getting those of us who survived attempted suicide, and that figure is 10 times higher than the general rate of attempted suicide in the US. And you can see also that we asked of them during trafficking and then after trafficking, and you can see kind of the change in whether they're still grappling with this. And many of them were still grappling 10 years after the trafficking with physical and psychological health issues. Next slide. Reproductive health issues, we wanted to know, were they pregnant? They reported that 71% said they got pregnant at least once. And there's a slide a little further back that expands on that. 67% said they had some kind of STD. 55% said they had at least one abortion. 54% said at least one miscarriage. And then pain during sex and urinary tract infection and vaginal discharge were all very high rates of return. Go ahead, next one. And then also violence, forced sex, punched, beaten, kicked. This is the way this all plays out. And victims also told us in the margins of this, some of what had happened to them. There was one particular story that I remember. A survivor said, I got into an argument with my trafficker. He wanted me to do something I didn't want to do. And he said, if you don't do it, I'm going to shoot you. And he pulled out his gun. And when I said, go ahead, shoot me, I didn't think he would. He shot me in the leg. And then he drove me to the emergency ward of the hospital and checked me in as a drive-by shooting victim. And she said they patched me up and sent me back to him. And about 9 months later, we got into another argument, and he took out his gun and he said, don't think I won't shoot you again. And she said, I couldn't imagine that he would, but he ended up shooting her in the other leg. And he drove her to the same hospital. And this is Salt Lake City, Utah, and checked her in as a drive-by shooting again. And they patched her up and gave her back to the trafficker. And so the kind of information that we collected, we think needs to be out there, both the stories and the stats, to help health providers understand what it is that trafficking victims are going through and what the sort of physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual devastation, really, that takes place in trafficking. And the emphasis now is on prevention, because as we're discovering from this study and others that are replicating it, once the damage is done, it's very, very hard to repair. And in fact, many victims say they're in therapy for the rest of their lives, that they will never recover physically. We've had a number of survivors tell us that they're infertile because they had so many abortions and so many STDs that were untreated that they can no longer have children. And so this is all part of the story that needs to come out to help us understand how to best address the problem. Keep going. Substance abuse in sex trafficking, the same kind of high numbers. 84% said they had substance use and abuse. Most of them said it was whatever I could get my hands on. So alcohol and marijuana were the highest, but there were all kinds of different things. There were mixed prescription and over the counter and, mixing drugs with alcohol and all kinds of funny things that we had never heard of before. But these were the main ones. And we heard a lot about overdosing and a lot about the fact that hospitals are not asking people when they come in with an overdose whether they might be, being run by a pimp or a trafficker, and they need to be doing that, especially if there's a serious kind of health issue related to the substance abuse. Next. And then victim contact with healthcare provider. And here I say it's where I said we stopped. We had about 125 interviews done, and we stopped. And we tabulated this, and we went out to find a healthcare law journal. I'm a lawyer, and so we published in a law journal. But we wanted to get the information out, and we wanted to be able to present it in Congress, and we wanted to be able to affect policy and program change. So 87% said they had gone to some kind of healthcare provider while they were trapped in the trafficking. 57% said to any kind of clinic. 63% said to a hospital or an ER. 29% said to Planned Parenthood. 22% to a general physician. And then you see urgent care, women's health clinic, neighborhood clinic, and so on. And we were surprised at the number of other, 13.3%. And when we asked, we always had a blank wherever we had other. They said, well, my trafficker had a grandmother who was a nurse, and on weekends she ran a clinic for all the pimps in town and down in her basement. And we would all come and be treated there by her. And someone else said, my trafficker had a gentleman's agreement with a physician that he would have a backdoor policy, and we would go in after 5 p.m. to his office, and he would treat whatever the problem was, and then we would pay in sex. And so we heard those kinds of stories too about the corruption in the healthcare provider field, and we still have yet to really begin to address the problems in that arena. Go ahead, next. And then where abortions were performed, we were able to get such great information from survivors about what had happened to them. 67% said they went to some kind of clinic for an abortion, most of them Planned Parenthood. But many of them didn't know where they were, what city they were in, what clinic they had gone to, they just knew they had gone to a clinic for an abortion. 16% said to a hospital, and when we asked about that, they said, oh, well, that was because we went to the clinic for an abortion and it was botched. And then I had to be rushed to the emergency ward so that they could stop the bleeding or take care of, a puncture or, something, or an incomplete abortion, something like that. So that's why that number is so high, because hospitals aren't usually recorded as doing abortions. And then again, other and multiple sites where they had gone. And I think there's one more, type of birth control used. A lot of them said they didn't have any kind of birth control, and that's why there's a lot of pregnancy in trafficking. But those who did said 52% said they used condoms, multiple types of birth control, Depo-Provera, the birth control pill, the IUD. Those were the main forms that we heard about. One young woman said, my trafficker sold me at 5-star hotels in Minnesota, and we would stand out in front of these hotels when the men were coming back from their conferences. They would purchase me, and he would always advertise me as not, not requiring condom. And so she said he would then later use the morning after pill. And she said, I had so many doses of that morning after pill, which of course, is really intense drug. And she said, here I am 5 years later, and I am still so sick. I'm physically so ill from all of those doses of the morning after pill that he would give me after each time that somebody had used me without any kind of protection. Next slide. And I don't know if we need to go over this right now, but what we've begun to do is to help health providers learn what the red flags are that indicate human trafficking. Some of the physical health indicators, the behavioral health indicators, and the social and environmental health indicators. And since this study was presented in Congress, a new law was passed that encourages authorized and appropriated money for health provider education, and encourages all health providers, healthcare providers, to be educated about the way that trafficking presents in their so we've begun to create specialized trainings that address what they might see and what they should look for. Go ahead. Next slide. And then this is the last slide that I wanted to share with you about that sort of amplifies what we found out about pregnancy and trafficking and abortion. So 71% said that they got pregnant at least once, but 21.2% said they got pregnant 5 times or more, which is an enormous amount of pregnancy in trafficking. 55% had at least one abortion, but almost 30% reported multiple abortions. And until we introduced this at the Department of Health and Human Services, that wasn't even an indicator. So now we're having them look and ask about number of pregnancies and number of abortions and number of forced abortions and that kind of thing, to try to get health providers to elicit some kind of information about what might be happening to young people who are presenting over and over and over again. So that Planned Parenthood, where somebody came in from the age of 13 to 33 and had those 17 abortions, that should never be happening now. Since the new law passed in 2008. And we'll hope, we have a lot of work to do to figure out, particularly in the political environment that we're in right now, how to address this issue. But at least this work has been done now, and we have the information that we can begin to create programs that directly address the problems, the health problems, and particularly the gynecological and reproductive and child bearing problems in trafficking. And I think I'll stop there, and turn it back to Michele.
Thank you. Sophia, am I correct? We have got maybe like only 7 minutes approximately, because I can go very quickly through the slides that we have, but I want to leave time for question and answer.
Yeah, I think if we end between 8:30 and 9-ish, we're okay. So, and because it's a virtual meeting, people can leave when they need to. That's the beauty of it. So I don't want you to have to rush through what you've got. So just take the time you need.
I'll synthesize though. Nevertheless, wanted to touch base on some of the negative effects of abortion, and just to sort of drive home the point that evidence shows that these negative effects are intensified with forced abortion that you have, like Laura just talked about in sex trafficking. We've got a comprehensive meta-analysis that shows that women who had undergone abortion increased an 81% increased risk of mental health problems, including a statistically significant risk of suicide behaviors, substance abuse, depression, and anxiety. Another negative effect of abortion, studies show a positive association between induced abortion and placenta previa and subsequent preterm birth. There's more information on that slide, but I think it's important to understand that studies clearly show these significantly statistical negative effects from abortion itself, and then to have an understanding how these effects are actually magnified for victims of sex trafficking where you have forced abortion. Next slide, please, Sophia. And Laura had put this incredible, I think, slide together because it just shows, the horror of exploitation. Here's a woman on the far left at the top before she became a victim of trafficking, and then there she is, obviously, on the far right. Sometimes pictures speak a whole lot louder than words. Next slide. And so the business of sex trafficking, the model of a market, again, Laura has taught me everything I know, and I think most people really in the know in the United States and even worldwide. And she's put this incredible slide together to make it very clear that you've got this model of a market. At the top, you've got distribution, and those are the traffickers, the pimps, the sex brokers. You have the demand side. And those are the sex buyers, the purchasers of commercial sex. And then you have the supply, which are the men, women, and children that are sold for sex. Next slide. And as pro-life feminism ascribes to, and as a pro-life feminist, we look to the root causes of social ills. So here we have the root causes of trafficking itself. At the very top is greed. On the far right, of course, is exploitation. And then to the left there is poverty. And that's what I'm going to talk about for a minute. Next slide, please. Female poverty is a primary driver of sex trafficking. And, I feel like, sometimes people are like yawning, oh gosh, poverty, here it goes again. But I think it lets us never lose sight of the horrors of poverty and the social ills that accompany poverty. Research shows that poverty, in fact, increases vulnerabilities to sexual exploitation. And I think a lot of this is common sense, too. Certain poverty populations are even more vulnerable to sex trafficking, and that is runaway and homeless youth, youth in foster care, victims of intimate partner violence and domestic violence that finally choose to leave and that are fleeing, individuals with disabilities, minors that have interfaced with the child welfare system, and any really individuals with a history of trauma or abuse, incest, psychological or emotional abuse and neglect. Most victims, again, of sex trafficking come from these fragile, low-income backgrounds. Next slide. Female poverty is a primary driver of abortion, right? So the primary reason women obtain abortions is financial or low socioeconomic status. The majority of women that undergo abortions in the US are poor or low income, approximately 75%. And the vast majority of women who obtain abortions are also single or not married, around 80%. The next slide. I wanted to just talk just very quickly about female poverty. There's so much to say about it, but we can reference that about 70 million women and children live on the edge of poverty in the US. In the US, more women than men live in poverty. 31.1 million people living in direct poverty. 21.4 million were women, right? On average, women continue to earn less than men. And what I find most interesting here is that unmarried mothers, of course, have the higher rates of poverty than married women, with or without children, and unmarried women without children. So that single mothers have the highest poverty rates of all women, of all people. There's a lots that we can say about this, but one of the primary reasons is studies show that the US lacks supportive work-family policies. Next slide. Before we move on to just quickly to talk a bit about feminism, I wanted to mention that most women in the US cannot gather up even $2,000 in 30 days to address an emergency. Just a couple more points on poverty. Wage gap exists even when factors are controlled, such as profession, position, or experience. And research shows that when working women have children, they receive a pay cut. But when men have children, they actually receive a pay raise. So, well, we talk about feminism. We know that it's, I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg says it the best. It's a theory of equal citizenship, where men and women have equal opportunity, right, to participate in our civil society, but based on our own individual talents and capacities. And we speak of pro-life feminism, we say that, we embrace the biological differences between men and women, and the biology of human life. And we recognize that when societies ignore biology and these differences, it becomes more likely that social arrangements will end up denigrating. And that's clearly what they've done in the United States against really women who choose to bring their pregnancies to term that are poor. That's why you have the highest poverty rates among single mothers, for example, or inadequate funding of childcare, for example. So whole life feminism, which is another term for pro-life feminism, it recognizes, exposes, and addresses the connections, right, between societal structures and the constraints that interfere with women's quest for equality, especially women as mothers. Because abortion tells us, that if women act like men and we have an abortion, right, where we elevate this wombless male anatomy, as Erica Bakayoko states, we're all on equal playing field. But when women choose to bring their pregnancies to term, especially poor women, again, you have these impediments that fuel female poverty and therefore sex trafficking and abortion. And just to quickly say, the impediments include equal pay for equal work, the lack thereof, the dearth of college-based and workplace childcare, for example, employee flex time, paid parental leave. And that's lastly, I'll say, this is my last note, and then bringing it back to Laura. Fiorella Nash, an incredible pro-life feminist author, really explains it best. She says, the ongoing struggle for equality needs the contributions of pro-life feminism if the complex challenges and difficulties facing women in the 21st century are to be adequately addressed. So thank you for the opportunity for sharing. Okay, Laura, are you ready?
I am, but I think we should just move to the questions.
Okay.
Because, the rest of my presentation is about the 1T and 4Rs that we should take up now that we know that there are health issues. And the 1T is training, and the 4Rs are referral and reporting and research and resources. And so I think I would love to hear questions from the audience if there are any, and just have a dialogue. I'm pretty sure that we have some expertise in the audience too.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both so much. I think this presentation is a wonderful example of the work that FCL does in examining the intersections of social issues, right? We can't really look at human trafficking without looking at abortion, without looking at female poverty, feminism, et cetera. So that's really, really wonderful. And I thank you both for bringing your expertise. We do have a question to start us off, and I welcome anyone. We have a couple minutes for questions. I see a hand raised, so I'll go to Alice next after this question. Feel free to put them in the chat as well. But Carol asked a question: how does New York RHA law affect sex trafficking? If either of you can speak to that.
The Reproductive Health Act, the impact that it has on really coerced abortion. The RHA repealed the fetal homicide provision, so that if a trafficker really forces the woman to abort at least a late-term pregnancy, post viability at 24 weeks gestation, that woman could not hold that trafficker accountable for the death of the child. The RHA also removes completely abortion from New York Criminal Code. So really, the trafficker, it removes a valuable prosecutorial tool for holding the trafficker who has coerced an abortion accountable for that forced abortion, essentially. It helps get the trafficker really, it takes him off the hook to a certain extent, you know, for a large portion. I mean, not to say that there aren't other ways that the trafficker could be held accountable for the forced abortion, but not with the full thrust because of the RHA, of the repeal from abortion from the criminal code.
Thank you. It looks like Alice has a hand raised. Alice, did you want to ask?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
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 I want to know if anybody can figure out the effect of the connection between the lockdown, which is going on a year, and an increase in trafficking. Anecdotally, I've heard that there has been an increase because women are just so desperate. Hello?
Yeah. Am I muted? Here.
Oh, Laura, I think you're muted.
Okay, there.
There you go.
Thank you for that important question. So we've been almost a year now in lockdown because of COVID, and there's a lot of new research about the link between the COVID and the lockdown and the increase in trafficking, particularly in women and children. This is worldwide. It's not just in the U.S. I think that the fact that kids are at their computers a lot more is making them, much more vulnerable to online exploitation. And the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children said that they've seen a 7 times increase in the number of reports of child trafficking since, when you compare this last 9 months to the 9 months before COVID. So there's some clear evidence now that's beginning to come in about that link between COVID and trafficking. And I think there'll be more in the near future. There's also, the federal government's doing a lot of, they're trying to address the problem on the front end, at least by publishing some, cautionaries. And on the Department of Health and Human Services website, there's a paper on the link between COVID and trafficking that I can get to you, Sophia, and you can pass it on.
Yeah, that would be great. And also, Laura, we've gotten a couple requests in the chat for this study. If you have any links or resources, if you'd like to email them to me, I can get them out to the attendees tonight, in addition to the recording of this as well. Yeah,
the study is published in full in the Annals of Health Law, which is the University of Loyola, a law review in Chicago, and it has all the charts in it too. But I can get these charts too because they're in color and they're easier to read. I'll get them to you. Great, thanks so much. We have 2 great questions that came in the chat. So the first one is just to thank you both, and then it says, I've read that sex trafficking increases during and after the Super Bowl. Can you tell us if there's a connection between professional sports and sex trafficking? I don't know if you two have run into that either in your research or in your work. Yeah, so I did a lot of work while I was at the State Department, and we were just in the foothills of consciousness then about the link between not just professional sports, but any gathering where there are large numbers of men without their families. So conferences and a lot of those kinds of big ticket items. But particularly, there's been a particular focus on the Super Bowl for the last 10 years. And there are organizations that all they do is go every year in February. We're about to, in Tampa, we're about to have this happen again. Link up with law enforcement, link up with the local authorities, link up with the local NGOs. They're out on the streets. And for anyone who's interested, we can show you some of the studies have been really clever. They've gone to the ads for escorts and for the various online dating, and Match Up and sugardaddy.com. And the number of ads, the increase in ads is exponential. The week before or 2 weeks before the Super Bowl, through the Super Bowl, and right after the Super Bowl. And so there's evidence, there's real evidence that there is a link between an upsurge in trafficking during the time of the Super Bowl. And I can tell you that one of the survivors who participated in my study, it was trafficked when she was 17 in Hawaii. And she was trafficked around Hawaii for a year, and her trafficker had this circuit: Hawaii, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and back to Hawaii again. Then he got the big bright idea that he would go to the Super Bowl in Miami, and he didn't know the area, and he didn't have the payoffs in place, and she was rescued. She was rescued on the street by an NGO who found her. And she said for 2 years in Hawaii, she had been praying to God on the streets that somebody would notice her and rescue her. And it took having him fly them out to the Miami Super Bowl before she was rescued. So the work that is being done around Super Bowls, I think, is really important. But there are other things too. They say that during hunting season, the trafficking around bars in the hunting areas, the motorcycle rallies in Sturgis, South Dakota, huge amount of trafficking when all those 7,000 motorcyclists come into town. A lot of that has yet to be addressed. We know it's happening, but we don't have the programming like we do for the Super Bowl.
Okay, maybe time for one or two more questions. So the next one, we got two in the chat, and I'm going to kind of combine them, see if you can speak to either both the sides of this. So someone asked, what level of government or what can government do that will make the greatest impact on this issue, on human sex trafficking? And someone asks, what could the church do or people of faith do, institutions of faith do differently? So I don't know if you can speak to government and or institutions of faith, either of you, about what either makes the most impact. What have you seen in your work?
I mean, Laura, I can say something maybe about the church, and that is for, folks to get trained, at church, the clergy or pastors, so they can identify, a victim of sex trafficking. And once that person's identified, then to make the appropriate referral. But I think it's an issue it's a great question that churches need to begin to address, and they need some of the basic training and then the ability to refer, a list of anti-trafficking organizations.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Michelle, thank you. Men and women religious they play such an important role because they're first responders, because people come to them and tell them, things that they would never tell anyone else. And so if you have your antenna up, one priest said to me, I used to go out into the fields where the pickers were coming in to pick strawberries, or in his local area in one of the coastal states. And he said, and every year the foreman would welcome me, and I would come in and I would tell people, we have services on Sunday, and here's my number, and you're welcome to come, and I'd love to, have you as a part of our community. And he said, and last year the foreman wouldn't let me in. And I knew something was wrong. I knew it wasn't right. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't quite figure it out. And then he heard one of our trainings, and he said, I'm pretty sure that's what was going on. And so that kind of training, so that you can have your antenna up, so that you know what to look for, and the way it will present in your daily work, in the work that you do. And that's why these sector-specific trainings are so important. And we don't have one yet for men and women religious. We need that. That's maybe something that St. Bernard's can take on, or somebody can begin to work on. It's critical. And I know that I work as a subject matter expert for the Department of Defense, and I'm urging them to train up all their chaplains, because that's something that that they can do, because chaplains are constantly hearing the problems of military families, and they may come across this, so they need to be trained up. So that's the first one. The second one is about government, and I would say it's both and. We need international action, we need national action, we need state action, and we need local action. And so all of those parts of government need to be trained, both trained up and need to develop programming to address trafficking. And they need to address that whole triangle of activity that we were talking about. So often we're sort of focused on the victims and saving the victims, and we will be doing that forever. It's like a mop-up job. It's a big constant mop-up job unless we can get to the traffickers, prosecute, convict, and sentence them, and unless we can get to the buyers who are fueling the trafficking and help them understand how they are, with the role that they're playing in empowering, making powerful very bad guys, and exploiting women and children, because I think these are parts of it that men often don't think about. They just think about, well, it seems to be okay. My friends are doing it. Everybody else seems to be doing it. And they haven't really had the kind of exposure to the harm that they're participating in. So all parts of that triangle of activity need to be addressed at all levels of government.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I just wanted to point out to people a link that Michael put in the chat. It looks like there's a prayer service or Stations of the Cross in Rochester this coming Monday to pray on this issue at 12:45 p.m. at Sacred Heart Cathedral. So that's just a local resource, a local thing you can do if you are faith-based and would like to join that on Monday.
Wonderful. And I will say, I think prayer is really important. I can't tell you how many survivors I talked to who said that in the depths of darkness, when no one else was there, they found God. God was there for them, and God was a part of their rescue. And so I think that is really critical to understand in terms of the work that we have to do to develop expertise and programming, and to continue to pray.
All right, I know we are getting here time, so if there's any last minute lingering questions, I think that last one was a big one on, on churches and on government. So that was a good note to end on, I think. Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. I know we've covered a lot of material tonight, a lot of information on a whole host of issues. So I will be sending a follow-up email with the link to this recording, a link to some of the things that were mentioned today. And I just want to end thanking Michele and Laura so much for your time and for bringing your expertise to us. This was really, really, really wonderful, really enriching.
Thank you. I hope you'll have us again.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.